And I tried to take as many pictures as I could and to count how many people of color are there here today out of the 2,000 attendees. Guess how many? 15 people of color and 15 Asians. A fraction. Hi, this is Mike Balaban. Welcome to another episode of BAMMER Talks. Today I'd like to cover the thorny subject of racism within the LGBT community, both blatant and unconscious. And I'd like to cover it from the 1970s and 80s when I was first coming out, right up through today in the early 2020s. When I was in my 20s, the universities that I went to, the corporations that I joined, the bank training programs that I was part of, they were all pretty prestigious and selective. And as part of their selection process, usually 5, maybe 10% of the people admitted into those groups were people of color. Not surprisingly, I got to know them and they became among my best friends, but they were in a decided minority. For me, as a white person, I didn't really think about it. I didn't notice the absence of people of color around me. But if you were one of my friends who were black, I have no doubt that it would have been very noticeable, perhaps uncomfortable, although they learned how to deal with it and to fit in and be okay. Well, this went on in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the world slowly began to change, and people have begun to get a little bit more in contact with other people who aren't like themselves. But just to give you an example of the most egregious of my experience in the 80s and 90s, when there was a segregation of color, I went to a circuit party event in Atlanta, Georgia called Hotlanta, and I ended up at a pool party in the home of one of the locals and his husband on the Saturday afternoon of that weekend, at which 200 to 300 people by word of mouth had been invited and showed up. And in the photos, which I will show you a couple today, you will see that there is not a black face among them. It was amazing, and yet I didn't even notice it at the time. The irony was that I was staying with a black friend and had invited him to join us, but he was unable to because of his medical residency program. Had he come with us, the photos would not have been so obvious. At any event, a lot of people, when I throw those photos up on my Instagram page now, comment, particularly young millennial, Gen Z, kind of very woke, self-aware gays, lesbians, and trans people, like, where are the people of color in your photos? How come it's so monochromatic? And they accuse me of racism. And I have to go back and describe, there was racism, but it was unconscious. I wasn't aware of it. It was subliminal. And it was a part of the times. We just weren't thrown into contact with a lot of people who weren't like us. Now jump ahead to 2019. I went to P-Town, Provincetown, which is one of the more popular gay resorts, and I attended a tea dance, which is the big staple of the day from 4 to 7 p.m. in the afternoon around a pool and a big deck. And 2,000 people show up from 4 to 7 p.m. and dance and swim and drink and schmooze. And I take photos of it, and obviously a lot of them very attractive, for my page where I put up thirst traps. And the day after I posted some of these photos that week in 2019, I got a lot of criticism. Where are all the people of color in your photos? And I was taken aback. I hadn't realized that I'd been so unaware of it. So the next day, I went back to the tea dance. I pulled out my camera, my phone, and I was hobbled on crutches that year, but I still managed to get around some across the deck and the dance floor. And I tried to take as many pictures as I could and to count how many people of color are there here today out of the 2,000 attendees. Guess how many? 15 people of color and 15 Asians. A fraction. Now, there are many reasons for that. Some of it is Provincetown is next to Boston, historically known as one of the more racist, subliminally racist cities in the country, very segregated neighborhoods, etc. So the people that come out are more inclined to be white. People of color may not feel comfortable coming there. Even if they do feel comfortable, it's very expensive in P-Town, and the average per capita income of whites versus blacks in our country is decidedly different, with whites making more money and able to afford perhaps more expensive accommodations. And maybe it's just that some of the blacks could have come to P-Town, but they didn't want to be one of a few black faces there, so they chose not to go. At any event, it made me start thinking about this inbred racism that none of us, unless you're a person of color, are even aware of. It takes place all the time. And I was talking to a younger black friend of mine, and he said, Mike, I'm glad that you're on this learning curve and you're starting to be aware of some of the things that we have to deal with. But don't beat yourself up too hard. You're not alone. There are many people in your situation, the majority, in fact. And if you want to take care both to learn about this issue and understand racism a little better and the difference in black and white cultures, and if you also want to take care of some of the haters who are dumping on you, why don't you join me as my guest at an all-black and Latino LGBTQ Cultural Arts Festival that I'm going to be attending in Cancun, Mexico in another few weeks. And he approached the organizers of the event to make sure I was welcome. And they accepted the notion that I would join them, and I agreed to do it. I showed up, and I was one of 2 white people out of 322 attendees at this 4-day event. And as you might guess, it was rather daunting at first. I walked in feeling a little awkward, somewhat uncomfortable, out of place. Now I know what it's like to be one of those groups of 3 or 4 black men huddled together in P-Town, arriving on their own, looking around for someone like themselves. That was me. One of the differences that I noticed right away is that white people, at least me and my friends, tend to be fairly self-contained, not as emotionally expressive right off the bat with people we don't know. And I walked into this group in Cancun, and not to be stereotypical, but it was almost like going to a gospel church. There was expressionism, there was emotion, there was backslapping and hugging and hallelujahing, to be a little bit exaggerated. And I didn't feel comfortable because that's not me. But as the weekend went on, I gradually got more comfortable, began to meet more people, to feel more at home and not out of place like a fish out of water. And I became looser and more expressive and more emotional. So that was an interesting part of the weekend. The other part was I expected to see a group of 300 black men, a lot of them hot black men, just because of stereotypes. And not surprisingly, there was a small group of very attractive black men in the 300 there assembled. However, it was 50-50 men and women. There were lots of family members, parents, aunts, nieces, nephews, goddaughters, all in support of their black, lesbian, and trans relatives. And I was wondering, what was it about the black culture that incentivized and made welcome people that weren't gay men? Because if it was a group of 200 or 300 gay men, gay white men, there might be a few blacks in there. There would be almost no women. A couple of lesbians or straight friends that felt comfortable hanging around with us. By and large, we look to hang around with our own. And I asked a few people, why is that? And the answer was really revealing. If you are black and you're a member of the LGBT community, you belong to 2 minorities. And you have to deal with them every day when you walk out into the world. And they can be oppressive. If you are a person of color, that's a minority status you cannot hide. If you are LGBTQ, you can choose, depending on who you are and how expressive you are, you can choose to hide your sexual orientation or gender identity difference and only tell people when you want to. As a result of that difference, if you're a person of color and you're LGBTQ, the priority of those 2 minorities, color takes precedence over sexual orientation and gender identity. You own up to both, you're glad to be a part of both, you welcome others from both, but color is the most important difference. And that was very telling. So the result was I got a lot of exposure. I was hanging around the edge of a pool talking to someone, and someone in the pool, just standing below me, looked up and said, "You weren't just recording me with your phone, were you?" And I'm like, "Excuse me? I noticed you with your phone in another position on the other side of the pool a moment ago. And it was cocked at such an angle that I thought you might be recording me." And I'm like, "No, I wasn't doing that. I'm happy to show you my phone." And she said, well, I'm a closeted basketball coach at a university in the Midwest, and I can't afford to be out and I can't afford to be known. And therefore, I can't afford to have a video like that show up. As a basketball coach, we develop peripheral vision, and that's when I saw you out of the corner of my eye. So we started chatting, and I shared with her that I was the founding board chairman of Athlete Ally, which works to make sports more welcoming and inclusive of LGBTQ athletes. And so we bonded over that, and I think she may have got involved with Athlete Ally after that weekend. And by the end, she said, we heard you were going to be here. We heard there was going to be a white blogger in our midst. And there was some cynicism and some skepticism and wondering, what is he doing here? And why is he wanting to look at us and report on us? What's he going to say? And I tried to explain, I'm here to learn and observe and hopefully become more sensitive and be able to impart some of it back to my audience on my Instagram so they too can learn and become more sensitive. Because the more we know and understand each other, the more likely we are to get along. As a result of that, by the end of the weekend, I felt really comfortable. I was so glad that I'd gone. It was a learning curve for sure, and I have a lot of things yet to learn. It's a challenge to overcome my subliminal and unconscious racism every day, and I'm still working on it. But, you only can do it if you start and you try, and that's what I'm doing. And I hope you all have experiences like that in your life. If you've ever had to deal with racism from one side or the other, please share with me how you manage that and where you are in your process. Thanks for listening. Another episode of BAMMER Talks. This is Mike Balaban.